Right, so this is just a Hangout, a Blender 3D Hangout, just to make sure that this account keeps its ability to go live. So this is just a project that's being worked on for something that cannot be revealed. But I'm just working on this. Might as well stream this to keep the TikTok gods happy. But this is going to be a little awkward because we're in TikTok format. Which means working in a restricted, let's double click that. Let's just rename this TikTok. TikTok properties. Whoops, dang it. TikTok 3D. 3D. So it's just basically a couch, and some aspects of it are pretty rough modeled because to get this shape in here, this inset, and for it to properly carry around this corner, you've got to carry it underneath the mesh, but we don't need it to go all the way because it's not a proper structure. We're not creating a proper structure, we're creating the impression of a proper structure. So we don't have to model this as if it were the blueprint for something that would actually be made. We just need to model it so that we get a functional mesh. So in order to get this to wrap around the corner properly, because if we don't do that, you get all sorts of weird shapes and pinching around here, because if we just if we select that, drop out of, so we can see that this is the shape. Let's just deselect that. That's the shape. That's the underlying cage, the low resolution cage that the subdivision is assigned to. So it is an incredibly simple, very basic mesh, but in order to get this corner at the bottom here to shape itself properly, we have to continue this inset down and around, because if we, so there's a problem depending on how you structure your meshes. When you assign the subdivision surface modifier, so we want this section to extend beyond this corner, because the structure of the mesh itself causes problems when you add a subdivision surface modifier, especially when you have a restrictive or restricted shape as the basis for which you have the subdivision assigned. So we have to try and extend that all the way. So for example here, let's just, again, because we're just trying to get a functional mesh so that we get a functional high res that we can later on bake our normal maps from. So you have to do something like this in order to get a clean, should we say, termination of this kind of shape or this kind of structure internally within a face. And it can be quite tricky to do even when you know what you're doing, because we want to keep this away from this edge, because this structure that we need to terminate this shape would cause problems if it was placed here near the corner. So we have to extend this all the way out here to avoid creating problems here. And of course, because this is underneath this couch settee, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how that works, relatively speaking, just so long as it produces a clean edge that will then allow us to create or generate a functional normal map when we come to bake it later on. So turn that back up and turn that back up. And so it's been modeled in sections because it's a very awkward shape. So rather than trying to make the armrest and extending it backwards and then trying to figure out how to then match the back to the corner, it's just easier to model this entire section as a separate mesh and then butting it up to the armrest, because this join is a safe area in which you can join things together. So in other words, what you're trying to do is mitigate the amount of work that you have to do in order to join. So this is a separate mesh and this is a separate mesh. So if this was one entire mesh, it's much more difficult to join this to this at this corner than it is to join this entire mesh to this in the middle, where it's just a straight line. So when you're making your meshes, you want to think about things like that. So the temptation would be to model the entire arm as one mesh, but that presents a problem, as we've just been saying, of how you resolve this join between the armrest and the back. So to avoid that, what you can do is just model, well, in this case it's the back and a partial arm, because that's easier to create the join than it is to try and do that with the arm and back being completely separate. Because let's just so that's the structure of the join, and trying to do that across diagonal with two separate meshes when you have to try and replicate the structure across the two of them in order for them to match up correctly. So the structure is exactly the same. It's easier to contain complex joins, shapes, forms, whatever in a single mesh than it is to try and join two separate meshes at a complex joint. So what needs to be done now is the seat. Oh, and this has got mirror. Mirror modifier is your friend. So if we take a look at that, yoink, so there's X, so that's the armrest, X, and that's the back. Mirror modifier is your friend with these kinds of things. You don't want to be doing more complicated mesh editing than you need to. So wherever possible, use the mesh modifier. Not the mesh modifier, use the mirror modifier. Alright, so that's the seat height. Might have to drop that down. You can take advantage of this loop. Just make sure all of that is cleaned. So we need to, alright, so let's split this in two. So tab, loop cut, get rid of that, delete. And then what we can do is use the mirror modifier again. So let's just generate mirror X. That's okay. Viewport wireframe. So we'll need to add the subdivision to this at some point, but what we want to do here is try and replicate this mesh structure in the seat. So we want to be putting the loop cuts in roughly the same place. We can always come back to this and place them properly. But we need to make sure that when we're doing that, our origin points are all the same, because our location and position coordinates are based on, well, in this particular example, or in this instance, the origin. So we have to make sure they're all in the same place. So that's the center grid, object, set origin, origin 3D cursor. So now let's select that and that, shift, enter edit mode, and then check location, so that's 0. About that one, that's 1. that one. That should really be, what's the loop for that? That's 9.5. Right, so now we can do that. 9.5 for that. 0.95. So the reason for doing this is so that when you apply the subdivision surface modifier, the mesh deforms itself in a uniform way across all the mesh objects. And we might need to add a loop for this. Well, we might not need to do that actually, but we might need to add a loop to accommodate this corner, these edge loops, and the flow of those, because if we add so we might need to get rid of this front face. Oops. Delete. And then shape this. So vertex. Let's pull that out. So where is that? It's 1.6, 1.6, 1.8, 1.8. Right, so that, yeah, that's where the join is, so that's 1.6 as well. Let's make that 1.7. That's okay, so 1.7. It's 1.6. So what we could do is this. So we have a vertex here that would latch onto that, and a vertex here that latches onto that, but we maintain roughly a quad structure. So maybe we should do that there. So knife tool, yoink, to the edge, return, and then J, vertex, vertex, J, and that splits that or creates an edge between the two vertices. So now we've got a closed quad structure. Because if we don't do this, what will happen? So let's just undo that. If we add subdivision to this, it'll curve like that. And we kind of want to avoid that. So what we need to do is what we just did. Don't like the knife tool, this thing. It behaves slightly different to the way that if you press the shortcut key, it'll snap over the edge that you are wanting to start your cut on, whereas the knife tool itself doesn't give you any sort of intuitive indication that that's what it's doing when it starts the cut. Cut, vertex, J. So now we have a much more controllable corner. That will allow us to get a sharp corner. So let's use snap. Where's the... Oh, we didn't have that selected. Okay, so select, select. So selected to active. Selected to active. Oops, that's the wrong one. Select to active. And we could, whoops, we could just leave this as is. Don't have to be too concerned about this gap in the corner. So let's extend this front, extrude, loop cut, oops, loop cut, one 6. Selection to active, snap. Whoops, what did we do? Selection to active. And then pull this underneath. So extrude. Oops. Or use the shortcut key, which is just the E key. Okay, that's so do we want that's 0.7. So selection to active. Add another loop cut because whoops daisy. Undo because we want to replicate that curve around the bottom. Selection to active. So that'll give us a bit of a gap because of the way that the subdivision surface modifier is working. But we can change that. So do we want that to be .6? That looks okay. So that's what we've got so far. And again, we don't need to worry about what's going on down here because this is just going to be a high-res mesh that we can use for baking normal maps. So all of this is just to facilitate making a high-res that we can bake from that's going to give us functional normal maps. But we'll call it quits there. Again, this was just to maintain the account to make sure that TikTok doesn't suspend access to Studio, TikTok Studio. Right, so let's just save this. Yeah, so we'll save this and then maybe we'll do another Hangout at some point. Because I'm doing quite a lot of work, but it can't be shown on screen because it's for a new service that is, I can't even describe what that is without possibly breaching TikTok's terms of service. But anyway, we'll call it quits there, and that looks okay. So I'll fiddle around with the seat now in full screen so that I can see what I'm doing properly. Right, so thanks for lurking, lurkers, and do the things, you know, the things that you need to do, and we'll see you on the next live stream. So bye for now. Yoink.